The rain came quietly to Brooklyn that morning, a fine mist that turned into steady drops, washing the sidewalks in streaks of silver. By 7:30, the neighborhood cafe on Franklin Avenue was alive with the hum of voices, the hiss of the espresso machine, and the chime of the door as customers rushed in to escape the wet chill outside. Olivia Hayes moved behind the counter with practiced ease apron tied, snug around her waist hair, pulled back through loose strands always slipped to frame her face. At 26, she was already accustomed to long mornings that blended into long nights. This cafe job was her anchor, the second shift at a bookstore across town. Her lifeline and the unfinished degree in journalism, a dream she refused to surrender. Bills stacked on her kitchen counter, a landlord who never smiled, and a roommate who tried to split groceries late. Yet somehow Olivia carried a brightness with her. She remembered names, remembered how Mr. Davis wanted only half a pump of vanilla. In his latte, remembered the construction workers who teased her if she forgot their double shots. Remembered the tired mother who needed an extra napkin. Small kindnesses kept her going. The cafe itself was modest exposed brick walls, hung with paintings by local artists' shelves, with jars of beans and biscotti, and in the corner stood a piano whose keys had long been silent. Outside, the rain streaked the wide front windows, blurring the view of passing umbrellas. Olivia took orders with a smile that was genuine, even on mornings when her eyes ached from lack of sleep. She joked with a college student, nervously reciting lines for an audition. She comforted a delivery driver whose order had been mixed up, and she slipped an extra cookie into a bag for a man who looked like he had not rested in days. It was this rhythm, familiar and almost mechanical, that made her notice when something disrupted it. In the farthest corner, by the rain-fogged glass, sat a man she did not recognize. He had entered quietly unnoticed, and now he sat as if he belonged to the shadows. A dark coat hung loosely from his shoulders, his white shirt open at the collar. His hair was damp at the edges, and his hands rested on the table where a simple glass of water had been placed. He had not ordered. He did not look at the menu or at the people around him. His gaze was fixed outward through the curtain of rain, as though searching for something that could not be found. There was a gravity about him, a stillness that seemed out of place amid the bustle. Olivia tried to focus on her orders, but every few moments her eyes returned to that corner. Something in his posture spoke of exhaustion, deeper than lack of sleep, of a heaviness that came not from the weather, but from life itself. Customers came here to warm themselves, to feel seen, and he had chosen silence instead. She finished ringing up a cappuccino, and then, acting on instinct rather than duty, poured a fresh cup of coffee. She added a touch of cream, not too much, and carried it across the room. Setting it gently in front of him, she said, her voice low but clear, "This one is on the house." The man turned slowly, as though startled from a long distance. His eyes met hers. They were dark layered with grief, yet there was warmth hiding beneath the weight. For a moment he said nothing, and Olivia wondered if she had intruded. Then he inclined his head, a small acknowledgement, and wrapped his hands around the cup. The steam rose between them, curling in the dim light, and she saw the slightest shift in his expression. Something inside him loosened almost imperceptibly, like a locked door moved by a gentle push. Olivia offered a brief smile, not the polite one she used at the register, but one that carried no expectation, then returned to the counter. She did not linger. She had customers waiting lattes to foam croissants to serve. Yet as she moved, she felt the weight of his gaze still on her. What she could not know was that the man before her was Ethan Ward, 34, once hailed as a visionary of the tech world, a billionaire who had graced magazine covers before tragedy erased him from the stage. 3 years earlier, he had lost his wife in a sudden accident on a rain-slick highway, and since then, he had chosen absence. He left the boardrooms, left the headlines, left the life that had demanded every part of him. He preferred corners now where no one asked questions and no one expected answers. But on this morning in this modest Brooklyn cafe, a young woman had placed a cup of coffee before him without knowing who he was, and it reached him in a way fortune and sympathy never had. Ethan lifted the cup, inhaled the aroma, let the warmth seep into his palms. Outside the rain fell steady, but inside he felt something stir for the first time in years. Olivia, tying her apron tighter as she took another order, remained unaware of the shift she had set into motion, unaware that a story far larger than herself had just begun with a simple gesture of coffee freely given. The following morning, the rain had eased, leaving the Brooklyn streets glistening beneath a pale winter sun. The cafe opened to the usual crowd, a line forming quickly as commuters stopped for their daily fix before rushing to the subway. Olivia adjusted the chalkboard sign outside, brushed the drizzle from her sleeves, and slipped back inside where the warmth of the espresso machine greeted her. She tied her apron, checked the pastry case, and moved to the register with the rhythm of someone who could balance 10 tasks at once. Yet her thoughts wandered to the man in the corner, from the day before, the one whose eyes had carried storms and who had accepted a cup of coffee like it was more than a drink, like it was a lifeline. She had gone home thinking about him, wondering if he would return, half hoping and half expecting that he would vanish into the city's endless crowd. But when she glanced toward the window seat that morning, her heart skipped. He was there again, same table, same coat, same posture of stillness. Only this time he looked up when she passed. Their eyes met for a brief second, and Olivia felt heat rise in her chest, unexpected and unexplainable. She carried on with her orders until the line thinned, then walked over with a fresh cup of coffee, balanced in her hand. She placed it before him and said lightly, "You look like someone who forgot how to order coffee." His mouth twitched, almost hesitant, then curved into the faintest smile. A low chuckle escaped him, rough like a voice not used in laughter. It had been years since Ethan Ward had laughed at anything, yet somehow this young waitress, with her straightforward kindness, managed to pull it from him. Olivia straightened, surprised at the sound, and for a moment she saw not the weary man hidden in the shadows, but a glimpse of who he might have been before grief hollowed him. She wanted to say more, to ask his name, but a sharp voice cut through the room. A middle-aged man at the counter waved his receipt in irritation, complaining loudly that his order was wrong, his words sharp and dismissive. Olivia hurried back, apologizing, fixing the mistake as quickly as possible. The man muttered about incompetence, his tone unkind. Olivia's smile wavered, but held as she slid his corrected drink across the counter. Ethan had watched the exchange. When the man finally left, slamming the door behind him, Olivia exhaled, shoulders sagging for just a moment before she caught herself and moved on to the next customer. By the time she returned to wipe a table, Ethan had risen from his chair. Without drawing attention, he placed a folded bill on the counter, tucked discreetly under his empty cup. Olivia noticed only after he had gone. It was not a small tip, more than she made in an entire shift left without a word. She frowned, touched by the gesture, yet puzzled. She wished she had the chance to thank him, to tell him she did not need his money but appreciated the kindness. But the man was already gone, swallowed by the city beyond the rain-streaked glass. That evening, as she closed the cafe, Olivia found herself replaying the moment when he had laughed. It was quick, almost fragile, but it had stirred something inside her. She thought of how his gaze had softened, how he had stepped in silently when her dignity was bruised by a rude customer. She could not name the feeling, only that she wanted to see him again, to understand what lay behind those eyes. Ethan, walking alone through the damp streets, carried her smile with him. He did not know why the words of a waitress lingered when board members, investors, and admirers once filled his days. Perhaps it was because she expected nothing. Perhaps it was because her eyes did not see the billionaire who had once built empires, nor the man who had lost everything, but simply a stranger who needed a cup of coffee. He had not planned to return to that cafe. He had wanted anonymity, silence, and escape. Yet now he wondered if silence was what he truly sought, or if what he craved was a moment like today, when laughter returned unbidden and pain eased for the briefest second. Olivia, cleaning tables and stacking chairs, felt the quiet of the cafe settle around her. She traced her finger over the polished wood where he had sat, wondering who he was, why his sadness seemed bottomless, and why she could not stop thinking about him. She carried the mystery home with her that night, a warmth mixed with curiosity, not knowing that the threads of their lives had already begun to entwine, pulled tighter by something as simple as coffee, as fragile as a smile, and as powerful as the first spark of connection between two lonely souls in a city that rarely paused to notice anyone at all. The week pressed on with its usual weight, and Olivia found herself pulled between shifts deadlines and the constant arithmetic of how much was left in her checking account. The cafe mornings were fast and loud. The bookstore evenings were quiet and long. And by the time she got home to the small apartment she shared with her roommate, she often collapsed onto her bed without even turning on the lights. Yet despite the exhaustion, she carved out moments for herself, scribbling entries in her anonymous blog where she wrote about the tiny acts of goodness she witnessed in the city, calling this series Small Kindnesses in a Big City. It was the only space where she could breathe, where her words mattered even if no one knew they were hers. Her readers were few but loyal, and sometimes a comment about how her posts had brightened a stranger's day was enough to make the grind worth it. In the middle of this rhythm, Ethan returned to the cafe. It was a gray Tuesday morning, the kind where clouds hung heavy and customers ordered triple shots just to face the hours ahead. Olivia spotted him instantly, the way his shoulders carried the same weight as before, though this time his eyes found her as soon as he sat down. She did not wait for him to order. Instead, she brought over a steaming cup of coffee and on a small plate set down a single cookie with a smile. "This one is my treat," she said softly. Ethan looked at the plate, then back at her, surprised. He wanted to ask why, wanted to tell her she owed him nothing, but the words refused to form. All he could do was nod once quietly touched. For years he had been invisible, not because people could not see him, but because they only saw the myth of him, the former CEO, the man defined by fortune and tragedy. Here was a woman who saw something else, someone worth handing a cookie to just because. He picked it up slowly, took a bite, and for a moment the heaviness in his chest lifted. The hours moved on, customers came and went, but Olivia found her eyes drifting toward him, noticing how he held the cup as though it was more than a drink, noticing the flicker of gratitude when their gazes met. That evening, after the cafe had closed, she hurried to her bookstore shift. The aisles were dimly lit and mostly empty, and she stacked paperbacks while listening to the sound of rain against the windows. At closing time, she opened her laptop and wrote a new blog entry about how sometimes the simplest gesture, like offering someone a cookie, could remind them they still belonged in the world. She did not name Ethan, of course. She did not even fully admit to herself that the post was about him. But her hands trembled slightly as she typed, as though she knew it mattered more than the others. The next morning was chaotic. Orders stacked up, milk-steamed voices overlapped, and Olivia rushed from counter to tables carrying trays. In the flurry, she bumped into a chair and spilled hot coffee across her sleeve. She winced at the sting, biting back a curse. Before she could retreat behind the counter, Ethan was there. He had moved quickly, almost instinctively, pulling a handkerchief from his coat pocket, the fabric worn but clean. He reached for her arm, gently dabbing the sleeve near her wrist, careful not to touch skin. His touch was respectful, precise, and she felt something more than relief at the sting fading. She felt cared for. Olivia looked up at him, startled by the sudden tenderness in his eyes. He withdrew as soon as the worst of the spill was blotted away. His expression guarded again. Mostly gone, he murmured. She held his gaze, then whispered, "Thank you," though the words felt small compared to the way her chest tightened. The rest of the shift passed in a blur. She caught herself smiling at odd moments, replaying the scene in her head. When she got home that night, she wrote again, this time about how the world could hurt you in small ways, and how sometimes all it took was another human being, offering help without hesitation to remind you that you were not alone. She closed her laptop and lay back, wondering why her heart beat faster when she thought of him. Ethan, in his apartment across the river, placed the handkerchief carefully back in his drawer. It had belonged to his father, a man who had taught him that dignity was in details, in small gestures. He had not used it in years, but tonight it carried the warmth of a moment that startled him. He thought of Olivia, of her laugh, of the way she carried herself with light despite the long hours. He did not know why he kept returning to the cafe. He told himself it was because of the quiet corner, because anonymity lived there. But when he closed his eyes that night, he saw her face, and for the first time in years, he drifted toward sleep with something like peace settling over him. The chatter of the cafe blended with the hum of traffic outside, as Olivia balanced a tray of cappuccinos weaving through the crowded tables with practiced grace. It had been nearly 2 weeks since she first noticed Ethan in the corner seat, and by now his presence was familiar, a steady shadow she had grown used to. He came in most mornings, sat by the window, and accepted her coffee with that same quiet nod that had become their ritual. Sometimes he stayed long enough to watch the rain slip down the glass or the morning light spread across the brick walls. Other times he vanished as suddenly as he appeared, leaving only an empty cup and a tip folded neatly beneath it. Olivia wondered about him constantly. She wondered what kind of work he did, why he carried sadness like a second coat, and why his laughter rare as it was felt like sunlight through clouds. She never asked, partly out of respect and partly out of fear that if she pressed too hard he would retreat. Yet curiosity lingered, and one evening after her bookstore shift, as she wiped down the counter and locked up, she overheard two customers chatting near the magazine rack. One man whispered, "Did you see that guy in the cafe earlier? Looks just like Ethan Ward. Remember him, the billionaire who disappeared after his wife died?" The other man nodded. "Yeah, the one who used to be on every tech cover. He was the future of Silicon Valley until he just vanished." Tragic story. Olivia froze her hand, still gripping the rag. The name echoed in her mind, colliding with the face she had been serving coffee to. Ethan Ward. She had heard the name before in headlines years ago, though back then she had been too busy with her own struggles to follow the details. She remembered vague stories of a young visionary who built an empire before 30, who had the world at his feet, who then lost everything when tragedy struck. Could it really be him? She hurried home that night, her thoughts spinning faster than the subway beneath her feet. In her apartment, she opened her laptop and typed the name into the search bar. Dozens of results filled the screen. Articles from Forbes, TechCrunch, the New York Times. Photos of a younger Ethan, sharper in appearance, but unmistakably the same man. His hair was neater, his suits expensive, his smile broad and confident. The headlines told the story she pieced together with a sinking heart. At 29, Ethan Ward had taken his company public, raising billions. At 31, he had been on the cover of Fortune, called a genius and a prodigy. At 32, his wife Claire had been killed in a car accident, and within months he had resigned, sold his shares, and disappeared. Since then, he had been a ghost. Sightings occasional and unconfirmed the media, speculating whether he was abroad in hiding or simply gone. Olivia leaned back in her chair, her breath shallow. The man who accepted her coffee with quiet gratitude, the man who laughed softly at her joke, was the same man who once stood on global stages. Her chest tightened with something she could not name. Awe, sadness, perhaps. Fear of what it meant to know a secret no one else in her cafe seemed to recognize. She clicked through images, articles about memorial funds, tributes to his wife, analysis of his fall from the spotlight. Every photograph of him from the past looked like another lifetime, compared to the man she saw now, hunched in a cafe corner carrying grief in silence. She closed the laptop, hands trembling. Should she say something? Should she let him know she knew? Her instincts warred inside her. Part of her wanted to approach him tomorrow, to tell him she admired his strength, that she understood his need for quiet. Another part feared it would break the fragile trust forming between them. If he thought she saw him as Ethan Ward, the billionaire, instead of Ethan, the quiet man, would he vanish forever? She lay awake late into the night, listening to the distant rumble of trains, replaying his eyes in her memory. She decided she would keep his secret. When morning came, she would treat him exactly the same. The next day dawned bright, but cold sunlight bouncing off puddles left by the night's rain. Ethan arrived as usual, sliding into his seat by the window. Olivia greeted him with her easy smile, setting down a coffee without comment. He studied her briefly, as though searching for something in her expression, then nodded once and lifted the cup. She felt her heart settle. She had chosen right. From that moment on, every exchange between them carried an undercurrent she could not name. She knew who he was. He did not know she knew. It gave weight to every word, every silence. When he asked how her studies were going, and she admitted she had paused college for financial reasons, she caught herself wondering what it meant to confess vulnerability to a man who once commanded billions. When he mentioned the weather and how the city smelled different after rain, she caught herself imagining the man behind the magazine covers, stripped of headlines and just noticing the air. She protected his anonymity fiercely, even when co-workers joked about the mysterious man in the corner. She said nothing, though inside her chest ached with the knowledge of his story. In her blog that night, she wrote a post titled "The Man at the Window." She did not name him, did not hint at who he was, but described a figure who reminded her that behind every stranger there was a history invisible to others. She ended with a line, "Sometimes the ones who look the quietest are the ones who have lived the loudest lives." Ethan, reading through random articles online later that week, did not stumble across her post, but if he had, he might have seen himself mirrored there, not as a fallen billionaire, but as a man still worth noticing. For Olivia, the secret weighed, but it also bound her closer to him. She had a chance to exploit it, to tell someone to chase a headline herself. Instead, she chose silence. It was her gift to him, though he did not yet know it. And in that silence, something fragile but undeniable continued to grow. The rhythm of their mornings began to shift subtly, almost imperceptibly, yet Olivia felt it every time Ethan walked through the cafe door. At first, his appearances had been random, a few days apart, but now he came more regularly, and each time he lingered a little longer. He no longer buried himself entirely in silence. Instead, he let conversations slip in soft and hesitant like sunlight after weeks of rain. One morning, as she wiped the counter, he asked about the book tucked into her apron pocket, surprising her with a genuine interest. She told him it was a collection of essays by a journalist she admired, her voice tinged with the wistfulness of someone who longed to return to classes. He listened intently, eyes steady, and when she apologized for rambling, he shook his head once. "Please," he said quietly, "keep going." She found herself sharing more than she intended about the way she wrote blog posts anonymously, about her mother calling from Ohio to ask if she was eating enough, about the roommate who left dishes in the sink. Ethan did not offer advice or judgment, only presence, and that alone made her feel lighter. Another morning, while the rain pounded against the windows, he admitted he used to play piano but had not touched one in years. Olivia's brows lifted, curiosity sparking, and she teased gently, "What did the piano ever do to you?" A shadow passed across his face, but before it could deepen, she said softly, "Maybe you should try again. Music doesn't judge." Her words lingered in him long after he left, echoing louder than any boardroom applause he once knew. That evening, he walked past the cafe and through the glass saw Olivia sitting at the old upright piano in the corner. The cafe had closed for the day, but she had stayed behind, pressing tentative notes into the silence. The keys were out of tune, yet she smiled as she coaxed a simple melody. Ethan stood outside, rain dripping from his coat, transfixed. He had not heard live music since before Claire died, and for a moment the sound pierced through the walls around his grief. He did not enter. He simply stood in the rain until the notes ended, then walked away with a heaviness that felt strangely lighter. Days bled into weeks, and Olivia found herself looking forward to his presence, to the way he began noticing details about her, too. When she burned her hand slightly on the espresso steamer, he left a small tin of aloe cream on the counter the next day with no explanation. When she rushed in late, flustered from the subway delay, he had already ordered her favorite muffin and left it with her coworker. These gestures unsettled her in the gentlest way, reminding her of something she had nearly forgotten, that care could go both directions. She had spent so long pouring herself into others, into customers, into her mother, into words on a screen, that she did not realize how much she craved being cared for in return. Ethan became that presence, steady and quiet, like a wall she could lean against without fear it would collapse. One late afternoon, the cafe emptied earlier than usual, leaving only Ethan at his window seat. Olivia took the chance to sit across from him, wiping her damp hands on her apron. She asked him what he thought about when he stared out at the street. He paused, considering, then said memories. Some good, some I wish I could forget. She nodded, not pushing further. Instead, she shared her own habit, how she watched people outside and tried to imagine their stories, how she used those observations for her blog. He tilted his head, interest flickering, and for the first time, she thought she saw a man who wanted to belong again. The connection between them grew not from grand declarations, but from these quiet exchanges, from the way they allowed silence to sit comfortably between them. Olivia began to sense that his healing was tied to being seen as ordinary, not extraordinary. She never mentioned his name, never hinted at what she knew. To her, he was just Ethan, the man who held coffee, like it was both shield and comfort. Yet inside her heart, something deeper unfolded, a tenderness that was not pity, but respect, admiration, and something dangerously close to longing. For Ethan, the healing came in realizing he could exist without headlines. Each morning spent in that cafe, each smile from Olivia, each small moment of humanity was like a stitch closing wounds that had remained raw for too long. He began to wonder what it would mean to step forward again, not as the CEO who had conquered Silicon Valley, but as a man allowed to live, to feel, to love. He did not say it aloud. He barely admitted it to himself. But when Olivia brushed flour from her apron and laughed at her own clumsiness, when she tucked her hair behind her ear and leaned on the counter to listen to him speak, he felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with coffee and everything to do with the possibility of being alive again. The air grew colder as winter settled deeper over Brooklyn, and the cafe became a refuge from the biting wind outside. Olivia worked longer shifts through the holiday rush, her smile warming customers, even when her feet ached from hours on the floor. Ethan remained her constant, appearing in his corner seat with a quiet nod each morning, staying longer now, sometimes enough for them to exchange entire conversations that stretched beyond pleasantries. Yet there was still a wall, invisible but heavy, and Olivia felt it every time his gaze drifted toward the rain, or when his words stopped short of confession. One morning the cafe was quieter than usual, the lull between breakfast and lunch, leaving only a handful of patrons scattered across the tables. Olivia brought Ethan his coffee and sat opposite him, resting her hands lightly on the table. She asked gently what music he used to play, coaxing a smile from him, and for a moment he told her about piano pieces, about how his wife used to sit beside him, humming off key, just to make him laugh. The smile faltered, his voice cracked, and before he could stop himself, the words spilled out. He told her about the night of the accident, about how Claire had been driving home alone, after visiting her mother about the phone call that shattered his world in seconds. He said he had thought he would never breathe again, that every breath afterward felt like betrayal. His eyes glistened with unshed tears, and his voice broke on the word wife, as though it still burned his tongue. Olivia's throat tightened. She did not speak, did not offer hollow comfort. Instead, she reached across the table and laid her hand near his, not touching but close enough that he could feel her presence. For a long while they sat in silence, the hum of the espresso machine filling the air until Ethan exhaled, as though releasing a burden he had carried too long. "You are the first person I've said that to in years," he whispered. Olivia squeezed her lips together, steadying her own emotions. "Sometimes the bravest thing is to let someone sit with you in your grief," she said softly. He studied her, and for the first time he felt not pity from another human being, but patience, the kind that said, "I am not afraid of your pain." Later that week, as snow fell lightly across the city, Olivia confessed her own insecurities. She told him she had always felt not enough, because she had never finished college, because she worked 2 jobs that barely covered rent, because people looked at her and saw only a waitress. Ethan's expression softened, and he leaned closer, his voice steady. "You see me when no one else does. That makes you more than enough." The words struck her deeper than she expected, loosening the knot she had carried in her chest for years. She blinked away tears and let herself smile, realizing that healing was flowing both ways between them, each pouring strength into the other without even trying. Their bond deepened in those weeks, not in dramatic declarations, but in small acts that carried weight. Olivia began leaving little notes on napkins under his cup, simple words like, "Hope is still here," or "You matter more than you think." Ethan collected them quietly, slipping them into his coat pocket, as if they were treasures. In return, he began noticing her exhaustion, bringing her a hot tea when her voice was hoarse, reminding her to eat when her breaks were too short. The cafe became more than a workplace or a hiding spot. It became the fragile ground where 2 broken souls began to rebuild. Still, shadows of the past lingered. Some days Ethan would fall silent mid-sentence, his gaze clouding as memories returned uninvited. On those days, Olivia did not push, did not ask for more than he could give. She simply sat nearby, letting him know he was not alone. And on nights when Olivia lay awake, worrying about tuition or unpaid bills, she thought of his words, "You are more than enough," and felt strength rise within her. It was not a fairy tale love, yet not even a romance she could name aloud, but it was something purer. 2 people carrying each other through the darkness, learning that healing sometimes begins not with solutions, but with the courage to sit in the silence together. The first sign of trouble came not from inside the cafe, but from outside, where the world never truly stopped watching. One Friday morning, as Olivia arranged pastries in the glass case, she noticed a man with a camera lingering near the window, his lens glinting as he aimed toward the corner where Ethan sat. At first she thought nothing of it, assuming he was a tourist, photographing the rain-slick streets. But when the man shifted angles and clicked again, her stomach dropped. By the next day, the whispers began. A tabloid website published a grainy photo of Ethan leaving the cafe with Olivia at his side, carrying 2 to-go cups. The headline screamed "Mystery Billionaire, spotted with waitress girlfriend," and the article spun wild theories about his return to public life. Olivia only discovered it when a coworker shoved a phone under her nose, snickering. "So this is your boyfriend." The screen showed her blurry face beside Ethan's solemn profile. Heat rushed to her cheeks, a mix of anger and fear. She wanted to deny it, to laugh it off, but the words caught in her throat. That evening, Ethan did not appear. The following morning, he came in later than usual. His expression tightened, his movements clipped. Olivia brought his coffee, as always, trying to act normal. But when their eyes met, she saw something shuddered. He spoke quietly but firmly. "I cannot be here anymore." The words stung like ice. She opened her mouth to protest, but he shook his head. "You don't understand. This is what happens. The world twists everything. You deserve better than being mocked because of me." She felt the floor tilt beneath her. "I don't care what they say," she whispered, but Ethan was already rising, pulling his coat tighter. His voice was low, almost broken. "I do." Then he left the bell above the door, jingling once, before silence swallowed the cafe. The days that followed were brutal. Olivia's co-workers treated her with thinly veiled amusement, some jealous, others cruel. Customers glanced at her with curiosity, some whispering about the photo they had seen online. The manager called her into the office and said her presence was causing a distraction, that maybe it would be best if she took time off until things calmed down. The words hit like a blow. She walked home in the cold, her apron folded under her arm, tears burning her eyes. How quickly kindness had turned into ridicule. How quickly a fragile connection had unraveled under the weight of exposure. In his apartment across the river, Ethan paced the floor sleepless. The old fear had returned, the fear of being seen, of losing someone else, to the relentless appetite of the public eye. He told himself pulling away was protection, that he was sparing her the cruelty he had endured. But deep down, he knew it was also cowardice. He was running again, just as he had after Claire's death, retreating into shadows where nothing could touch him. Olivia tried to distract herself with her bookstore shifts, with her blog, with late-night calls to her mother, but the hollow ache in her chest remained. She had not asked for this, had not chased headlines, had only handed a man a cup of coffee. And now she felt stripped bare before a world that thrived on gossip. She wrote in her journal that night, not for her blog, but for herself, a single line repeated, over and over, until her hand cramped. "I miss him. I miss him. I miss him." The city outside carried on as though nothing had changed, but for Olivia, every street corner reminded her of him. Every empty cafe seat whispered of what could have been. She wondered if healing had been an illusion, if some wounds were destined never to close. The storm of whispers did not fade quickly, but in the middle of that chaos, Olivia turned to the only outlet she had ever trusted, her anonymous blog. One night after another, grueling shift at the bookstore, she sat by her window, overlooking the Brooklyn streetlights. Fingers trembling over the keyboard, she wrote not about scandal or fame, but about humanity, crafting a post titled, "Even billionaires are just humans who need a cup of coffee." She described a man without naming him, a man who carried grief quietly, and who had once been handed kindness in the form of something small and ordinary. She wrote that healing does not arrive in grand gestures, but in moments of stillness shared between strangers. The post was raw, tender, and utterly true. She hit publish with no expectation, but by morning it had spread. Readers reposted it across platforms drawn by its honesty. It was quoted in newsletters shared in forums and praised for reminding people of their shared fragility. Within days, the entry had thousands of views, far more than her blog had ever known. Olivia did not bask in the attention. She only hoped the man she had written for might read it and understand. Ethan did. Late one night, as he scrolled aimlessly through articles trying to distract himself from the emptiness the post appeared before him, he read slowly, line by line, his chest tightening. Every word echoed with her voice. She had seen him, truly seen him, and she had not betrayed his secret. Instead, she had offered him dignity, even when she had every reason to feel abandoned. By the time he reached the end, his hands were shaking. He knew then that running was no longer survival, it was surrender. The next morning he returned to the cafe. Olivia was not behind the counter, but seated by the window, notebook open, though her eyes stared blankly at the page. When the bell above the door chimed and Ethan stepped inside, her breath caught. He approached slowly, as though unsure if he had the right to stand before her. She looked up, eyes wide, then narrowed slightly with hurt. Before she could speak, he said quietly, "I kept running, but you reminded me that pain does not have to be permanent." She blinked, her throat tight, and for a long moment they only looked at each other while the world bustled around them. Then she closed her notebook and gestured for him to sit. The silence between them was no longer sharp but soft, filled with possibility. Over the next weeks, Ethan began to change course. Instead of hiding, he chose to act. He announced through a quiet press release that he was establishing a foundation in his late wife's name, a scholarship fund for students who had lost parents away, to turn tragedy into hope for others. Olivia stood beside him as he drafted the plan, not as a figurehead, but as a companion who reminded him why it mattered. He told her one evening as they walked across the Brooklyn Bridge, the lights shimmering on the water, that it was her presence that had pushed him forward. "You did not save me," he said. "You simply reminded me I could save myself." She smiled softly, slipping her hand into his, and for the first time since Claire's death, he felt that touching another did not betray the past, but honored the possibility of a future. Olivia found healing in his company as well. She admitted her fears about returning to school, about never being enough. Ethan told her firmly that her worth had never been tied to diplomas or paychecks, that she had already changed a life his without credentials. The words sank deep, nurturing a confidence she had long buried. Together they built new rituals. Some evenings they stayed in the cafe after closing Olivia, scribbling in her notebook while Ethan pressed tentative chords on the out-of-tune piano, the melody halting but real. Other nights they walked through the park, sipping hot chocolate, their conversations drifting from books to music to memories. Healing was not a single revelation, but a series of small steps, fragile yet steady. The city still whispered. Paparazzi tried again to catch photos. Tabloids speculated about his reemergence, but Ethan no longer retreated. He held his ground, choosing not to let fear dictate his life. And Olivia, though sometimes shaken by the unwanted attention, found strength in the way he looked at her, not as a waitress caught in a rumor, but as the woman who had reminded him of his own humanity. The world might never know the full truth of their connection, but they did, and it was enough. One evening, as snow fell quietly outside the cafe, Ethan placed a steaming mug before Olivia. He had brewed it himself awkwardly, fumbling with the machine, but his smile was genuine. "Your turn to be served," he said. She laughed, eyes shining, and lifted the cup. In that moment, she realized that what they shared was not built on wealth or loss, but on the simple, unshakable truth that love begins where healing begins, in the courage to see and be seen. The night of the gala arrived with a kind of grandeur Olivia had never witnessed before. The ballroom of a mid-town hotel shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers, the air humming with the voices of donors, journalists, and executives gathered for the launch of the Claire Ward Foundation. Olivia stood near the back, a simple navy dress borrowed from her roommate, draped elegantly across her frame, her hands clasped tightly around the program. She had insisted on sitting in the audience, rather than at Ethan's side, wanting this moment to be his, not theirs. When he stepped onto the stage, the room fell into an expectant hush. Ethan wore a tailored suit, but no tie, his hair neatly combed, yet still carrying the natural softness she had come to know. His voice, when he began to speak, was steady, but low, resonating with sincerity rather than bravado. He spoke of Claire, of the love they had shared, of the loss that had nearly ended him. He spoke of the silence that followed, of the nights when he thought he would never breathe again, and of the unexpected kindness of a stranger who reminded him that grief could become a bridge rather than a wall. He did not name Olivia, but when his eyes swept the crowd, they found her, and she felt as though every word had been meant for her alone. Applause rose respectful and heartfelt, and as Ethan stepped down from the stage, cameras flashed, reporters whispered, and donors lined up to shake his hand. Yet his gaze kept drifting to the back, where Olivia sat quietly, her heart pounding. Later, after the speeches and toasts had ended, Ethan slipped away from the crowd. Olivia had wandered up to the rooftop terrace, seeking fresh air, her breath visible in the crisp night. The city stretched before her in a tapestry of lights and motion, beautiful and unrelenting. She wrapped her arms around herself, lost in thought when footsteps approached. She turned to find Ethan standing there, the skyline framing him like a painting. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he closed the distance, his expression soft but determined. "When you brought me coffee that morning," he said quietly, "I thought it was kindness, but it was more. You healed me in ways I did not know I needed." Olivia's eyes filled before she could stop them, tears blurring the city lights into a halo. She shook her head, trying to speak, but he continued. "You gave me back breath. You gave me back the courage to stand here tonight." She pressed a hand to her chest, overwhelmed, and whispered, "I never wanted anything in return." His hand rose gently to her cheek, thumb brushing away a tear. "I know. That is why it means everything." For the first time since they had met, she let herself lean into him, fully collapsing the careful distance she had maintained. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her as though anchoring himself to life itself. The hum of traffic below faded, the lights of the city blurred, and in that embrace, two broken pieces finally found their match. Olivia buried her face against his shoulder, feeling the warmth of his breath in her hair. the steady beat of his heart. When she finally looked up, their eyes met, and there was no hesitation. Their lips touched, tentative at first, then deepening with the force of everything unsaid. The kiss was not fireworks, but something stronger, the quiet certainty of two souls recognizing home. They pulled apart only when laughter from the gala drifted onto the terrace, reminding them the world still existed beyond this moment. But for them, the night had already reached its crescendo. For the first time, Olivia no longer felt like the girl who was never enough, and Ethan no longer felt like a man defined only by loss. Together they felt like possibility. The weeks following the gala unfolded like a new season in both their lives, not abrupt, but steady, a transition from survival to something resembling hope. Ethan did not return to his old empire, nor did he attempt to reclaim the crown of Silicon Valley. Instead, he founded a smaller company rooted in purpose rather than profit, a venture focused on technology that served communities often overlooked. He spoke at panels not about wealth, but about empathy, about designing tools that healed as much as they helped. Olivia watched from the sidelines, at first proud yet cautious, her heart swelling every time she saw him stand with quiet confidence, knowing she had witnessed the broken man who once believed he could never rise again. Meanwhile, she took steps of her own. With Ethan's encouragement and her own determination, she re-enrolled in night classes at the university, balancing lectures with shifts at the bookstore and cafe. The workload was grueling, but this time she did not carry the burden alone. Ethan quizzed her before exams, left notes in her textbooks that said, "You've got this," and celebrated each small victory with her. In turn, she reminded him that leadership was not about being the loudest in the room, but about walking alongside others. Together they discovered a rhythm built on mutual faith. One morning, Ethan surprised her by arriving at the cafe before opening. Olivia found him fumbling with the espresso machine, his suit jacket draped over a chair. When she raised an eyebrow, he grinned sheepishly and handed her a steaming mug, the foam uneven but earnest. "Your turn to be served," he said, echoing her first gesture months ago. She laughed, the sound filling the empty cafe, and accepted the cup, her eyes shining with something deeper than gratitude. Later that week, they returned to the piano in the corner. Ethan sat hesitantly, at first his fingers hovering above the keys, but Olivia placed her hand over his and whispered, "Music does not judge." Slowly he pressed a chord, then another, until the room filled with a melody, fragile but true. Olivia closed her eyes and let the notes wash over her, realizing this was healing made audible. The sound of grief transforming into creation. Their bond deepened in ways both ordinary and extraordinary. They grocery shopped together, debated over movies, walked through the park on Sundays. Yet there were also moments that reminded them of the journey they had traveled. When Ethan read her latest blog post aloud and told her she had the power to change lives with words, when Olivia sat beside him at his wife's memorial fund ceremony and simply held his hand, offering presence without expectation. Each gesture became proof that love built on healing was not fragile but enduring. Months later, on a spring morning, the cafe was busier than usual, sunlight streaming through freshly cleaned windows. Olivia balanced a tray when Ethan slipped in quietly, carrying 2 cups of coffee he had picked up from a cart outside. He set one in front of her with a grin. "Consider this repayment," he said. She looked at the cup, then at him, and something in her chest softened. It was never about repayment, she whispered, but she lifted the coffee anyway, their fingers brushing as she took it. They both paused, the air between them charged with the memory of how it all began. That night, as they walked hand in hand across the Brooklyn Bridge, the city glowing around them, Ethan spoke softly. It was never just coffee, it was healing, it was love, it was home. Olivia squeezed his hand, her eyes glistening, and nodded. Epilogue. Years later, Olivia stood in front of a lecture hall, her degree in journalism, finally completed, her voice steady as she spoke to students about storytelling. In the audience, Ethan sat quietly, proud as always, his presence steady and grounding. Afterward, they returned to the cafe, now renovated, but still carrying the same warmth, the piano, tuned and often played by local musicians. Ethan placed 2 mugs on the table, sliding one toward her. She smiled, touched the rim of her cup to his, and said, "We began here, and somehow we always return." Outside, the morning sun lit the streets, casting golden light across their faces. They rose together, stepping into a future built not from wealth or tragedy, but from the simple act of noticing one another. And as they walked away hand in hand, the city carried on around them, unaware that inside a small cafe, 2 people had found in each other the kind of love that does not shout, but whispers steady and unyielding, "You are enough."